Hello everyone, this is Miss Hannah. Would you let us know in the comments that you can hear us, and then we will be able to get started. Someone sounded. Hello. Okay, good. Hi everybody. So this is Allegra Davis Hannah. I'm your host today. And Professor Natalie Russell is a professor of biology. Is going to be your presenter. So Natalie, Professor Russell, would you introduce yourself?
Yes. So as Professor Hannah mentioned, I'm Natalie Russell. I teach biology here at TCC Connect. I've taught biology for the last about 12 years. And before that, I worked as a forensic biologist at the Dallas County Crime Lab. So I'm excited to be here with you today so we can talk about vaccines and some of the conspiracies behind the anti-vax movement.
Okay. And I'm sure all of our students are going to want you to come back and talk about CSI sometime.
Anytime.
Okay, so as you guys know, our webinar series this semester is about conspiracy theories and learning to discern truth from untruth. So Professor Russell is going to talk to us today about vaccines and conspiracy theories related to the anti-vaccination, sometimes called anti-vax movement. So can you tell us, how do we know what to believe? We get lots of information about vaccines from lots of places.
So that's a great question. And I think we have to understand, first of all, how science works. And when you're a research scientist, so anybody who would be developing a vaccine, who would be studying effectiveness of vaccines, any kind of harmful effects of vaccines, these would all be research scientists. And the way that they publish the information that they gather, the data they collect, their findings, is they publish them in peer-reviewed journals. And these are very specific journals. So there could be journals of virology that experts in that particular field are all going to be reviewing the publications of their counterparts. These are not like a magazine or a newspaper where I can write an opinion piece. This would be something that I would publish my findings. It's reviewed by other people who are experts in my field. And then my work is then built upon by others in my field. So when you're looking for good sources of information, first of all, you want to look at the credentials of the people who are publishing this information. And you want to look at the source. Is this a website or a blog? Or is this a peer-reviewed journal article that has been reviewed by other experts in the field?
So a peer-reviewed article is published because of its credibility, not because of how many people would be inclined to read it.
That is exactly right.
So it's different than clickbait. It's not
very different.
It's not printed because it's super fascinating.
Yes.
It's printed because it's valid.
And it's written for other people who are experts in that field. So that is one of the problems we'll talk about, is I think it's hard for lay people to look at these studies. So you may have an expert on one side or that says vaccines are safe, and here's all these studies that explain why vaccines are safe. Then you have another proposed expert on the other side that says vaccines are not safe, and let me tell you why. And they're providing these peer-reviewed journal articles that might be difficult for the layperson to understand the actual article.
So the information is dense and challenging.
That's exactly right.
Okay. So how do I know what to believe?
So we're going to talk about that today. And some of the way I want to go through this webinar is why we have a fear about vaccines, some of our processes that we go through when we think about whether we should vaccinate, some of the history behind the fears of vaccines. And then I want to take a little time to talk about the history of vaccines, because we would not be doing justice to this subject if we didn't talk about what vaccines have done for us to this point. And then at the end, we'll talk about some actual studies, science data, and what that actually supports.
Okay, I'm excited. So tell us about the anti-vaccination conspiracy theory.
Okay, so there are a lot of different thoughts. I have 6 of what I think are kind of the most common that I see or hear. The biggest one is that the MMR, so that would be measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, causes autism. That's one of the biggest beliefs of the anti-vaxxer movement. The second one is there's a preservative used in some vaccines, and we'll talk more about it in detail later on, called THIMEROSAL, which contains a type of mercury. And there are those who believe that THIMEROSAL is linked to disorders like autism, or it's just toxic. Then there is a general distrust of the pharmaceutical industry, and that there might be some kind of conspiracy between, this would have to be a very large conspiracy if we're talking about pharmaceutical industry, government, all researchers in the field, doctors, American Medical Association, WHO. I mean, this would be a huge conspiracy, but some people believe that that's the case. Some people just simply think, you know, there might be a risk for this vaccine, and I really don't think it does my child that much good. So the risk is really not worth the reward, because I don't really think these diseases are that bad anyway. Others think, well, the vaccines don't work, so why would I take the risk of getting a vaccine if it's really not going to provide any protection? And then lastly, some folks will say, you know what, I don't think the reason we don't have these diseases like smallpox and polio is due to the vaccine. I really think it's because we just have better hygiene today and our water is better, and that's why these diseases have been eradicated.
Which one of these 6 things is true?
0.
None of these 6 things is true.
None of these are true.
None?
No. And I am not part of the vast conspiracy, and I have not received any funding for this talk today.
How do we know? Okay, so I'm fascinated to hear about the history of vaccines, because I know from history class, Professor Wilson is in this room with us. She's just being very quiet for once in her life. I know from history class, right, that things like smallpox and even measles used to be, and polio used to be big problems and very lethal, right?
Absolutely. Yes. So smallpox is a great place for us to start. So for many of you, unless you are, you know, a senior in your age and you've traveled outside of this country, you've not personally witnessed smallpox, right? We are not even vaccinated for smallpox anymore because it's been eradicated. But if we look back, smallpox was recorded way back, even back to the 3rd century. About 3 out of every 10 people who get smallpox will die. Those who don't die can be left with scars, blindness. And there is a term called variolation that became popular around the 1700s. So this was sort of the precursor to vaccines. And because smallpox was so devastating, people were looking for ways to prevent smallpox. So what they did, they would take the dried pus of someone who was infected with smallpox. That's a great thing. If you're having lunch while you listen to this, I hope I just made your lunch better. But take the pus of one of these smallpox lesions, and then they would either scratch into another person's skin with that pus, or they would dry it and then they would inhale it through their nose. And what they realized was this purposely caused people to develop smallpox, right? But they realized it would be a milder form of smallpox than if they had gotten it the regular way that you would have it transmitted.
Did it work?
Yes, it did work. There were obviously there were people who had it more severe than others, but yes, they had a milder infection, and they called it variolation. It started in Asia, spread to Africa, India, and then the Ottoman Empire. The way it made its way to Europe, there was a woman named Lady Mary Wortley Montagu who had had smallpox as a child and was very severely scarred. She was the wife of the British ambassador in Constantinople, and she did not want her kids to have to deal with that. So she learned the practice when she was there, and she brought it back to Europe with her. And what she did when she came back to Europe, she tested it on prisoners and orphans to make sure that it was effective.
So not a lot of scientific ethics happening.
Not a lot of it. Yeah. We hope today our ethical practice is better than that. Maybe she got them to sign a form before. I don't know. But anyway, they survived and were immune to any smallpox outbreaks. So it became an accepted practice in Europe from that point forward.
Because their immune systems were able to fight off the lesser.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Now, here's the downside with variolation. With vaccines, you're not spreading the illness, right? You're giving the immune system the ability when it recognizes that illness to fight it off. But with variolation, you're purposely infecting people, okay, right? So that's not necessarily a great thing. Now, Edward Jenner was the first person to come up with a vaccine for smallpox, and this was in the late 1700s. And what he realized was, back at that point in time, there were people who were really dairy maids, right? Their job was to milk cows. That's what they did all the time. What he realized was cows have a disease that's similar to smallpox. It's called cowpox, but it wasn't nearly as viral, as deadly. And dairy maids would not ever contract smallpox. So what he realized was, because they were around cows so much, they would always get cowpox. It would be very mild. Then when they were exposed to smallpox, they would be immune. So what he did was he called it a vaccine because the Latin word for cow is vacca. So that's where we get vaccine from, because he was making it from this cowpox from a cow. Yes. So anyway, he tested it on a child because he himself had already had smallpox, so he wasn't a good candidate. Sure enough, the child was immune, and that was our first vaccination. So just to make a few more points about smallpox before we move on, in 1552, smallpox was eradicated here in North America, and then in 1980, it was eradicated worldwide. So that's just a little bit of history of smallpox. That's why we don't get smallpox vaccinations anymore, because it doesn't exist in the world any longer, except for in a lab somewhere. Okay.
Government controlled, likely. Just kidding, everyone. Tell us about polio, because these are images that I've seen before. I think this is something called an iron lung.
Yes, you're exactly right. So I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but I will tell you that I didn't live through any of the polio epidemic, but my parents, who were actually born in 1952, both tell me stories. They did live in the period of time when polio was still very prevalent in the United States. It actually reached a peak in the 1950s. And so, for example, in 1952, there were 57,000 cases of polio. The vast majority of those were children. And of those, almost half were left paralyzed. So the picture you see there is an iron lung. And the reason that they had iron lungs for polio was some of these children, or most of them were children, they were paralyzed to the point that the muscles in their chest and their diaphragm wouldn't work, so they couldn't even breathe. So the iron lung basically creates the negative and positive pressure to draw air in and out of the people's lungs, so they can't breathe without them.
Oh, I didn't know that's how it worked.
Yeah,
we did have a question specific to smallpox.
Yeah.
Somebody wanted to know how we know for sure that it's been eradicated and won't come back.
So, I mean, that's a good question. Essentially, they have not seen anyone infected with smallpox since well before 1980. So they have a period of time that they wait, right? Mm-hmm. That they have no infections before they call it eradicated. Now, smallpox is caused by a virus. Viruses are not living. They cannot live on their own without a host. So if it's a bacterial infection, it's more likely that it could hang around, especially if it's like a soil bacterium like anthrax or something. That might be a little harder for us to say it's eradicated. But smallpox, since it's a virus, if it doesn't have a host and is not actively causing infection, then we can say
it's dead.
It's dead.
We've killed smallpox.
Yes. Now, there obviously, because that would be, that is a virus that has been talked about for like biological warfare. And there are labs that still have smallpox. So, you know, if that were ever to be the case, we would certainly need vaccination program to fight.
What about polio? Has it been eradicated?
Polio has been eradicated in the U.S., but it has not in parts of Africa. It's called endemic, meaning it doesn't necessarily mean it's high numbers, but it means there continues to be rates of infection in those countries, which is why we still have to get vaccinated for polio, because we have global travel. So you have one person that comes to the U.S. If we weren't vaccinated, then there'd be a huge
remember
outbreak.
Ebola.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
So I think this is a picture of Dr. Salk vaccinating his own family.
It is, before it was even approved. And my parents tell me that they remember their parents taking them to line up in the community center when the vaccine first became available, because there was so much fear. You have to understand at that time, if you look back in history in the 50s, it was typically the highest rates of infection was in the summer. They would shut down public pools. Insurance companies would sell polio insurance to parents when they had newborns, because it was such a fear. And those of you who are history people, President Roosevelt, he was, a polio sufferer. He had contracted polio when he was 12 years old, and he was paralyzed because of that. And I think when I hear people say, oh, these diseases really aren't that bad anyway, I'd rather my kid just have the disease than have the vaccine. I think that's because we haven't witnessed, and I'm including myself, we've not witnessed what it looks like for there to be a polio outbreak and to see the fear and the results of polio, what it leaves children with.
So there's a video here, and we'll give you all a link to watch this video on your own.
This man, in the video, the reason that I wanted to include this, he's one of the last survivors of polio that still requires an iron lung. So he lives in Dallas, Texas. He's an attorney in Dallas. And it is a fascinating video. If you're not familiar with polio, he talks about when he was just a regular kid, how he gets sick, and then a few days later, he's lost his ability to walk, to play baseball, to do all the things that he enjoyed doing. So I think it's a great video if you're interested in knowing more about.
So he has to be in that all the time?
I think he says he can be out of it for about 2 hours a day.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. And the video is interesting because, these things are old technology. So when his started wearing out, he had to find a mechanical engineer in Dallas that could make parts for it because there's not a demand, for iron lungs any longer. So anyway. Very interesting.
Wow. And he's an attorney.
He's an attorney.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay, so tell us about MMR. I know that we still get MMR shots for sure.
We do. We absolutely get MMR. So MMR is just a vaccine for 3 different viruses: measles, mumps, and rubella. Probably the one we hear the most about is measles because we've actually had an increase in the number of measles cases that we've seen in this country. Measles was actually declared eliminated in the U.S. in the year 2000, but it is no longer. Now, because it was never eliminated worldwide, right? When we have people who come from other countries to Disneyland, let's say a couple of years ago that happened, and then you have a population that has not been vaccinated, then that's an opportunity for measles to spread. It is very highly contagious. About 90% of people who are exposed, so with us sitting here, if I had measles breathing on you, you'd probably be likely to get measles. It just spreads very easily.
Except I've had an MMR shot.
So you're good.
Okay.
Did you have all your MMR shots?
I assume.
Yeah, hopefully your parents took care of that. So people will say, oh, measles. I hear this all the time. My uncle had measles and he lived, and it's not that bad. I'd rather my kid just get measles. But let's look at the data, okay? And so if you notice on the little chart here, 1 out of every 4 people who get measles have to be hospitalized. 1 out of every 1,000 get brain inflammation or encephalitis, and then 1 to 2 per 1,000 die. So it's still a disease that can have complications. If you just look at it from a cost standpoint, 1 out of 4 people being hospitalized, that's a huge cost on our economy if you don't even think about deaths and brain inflammation.
Also, it's unpleasant, right? It causes pain.
Yes.
So, I mean, there's like a human pain and suffering cost as well.
Exactly. Now, mumps we don't hear about, but before the mumps vaccine, it was actually the leading cause of deafness in children. So there's certainly effects of mumps besides just these big swollen things that you get. Now, rubella, you may have heard referred to as German measles. The biggest fear with rubella is for pregnant women because it can either cause miscarriages or birth defects. So that's something that, we want to make sure that we keep under control.
Yeah.
Now, I want to say one thing, and I'll mention it later, but if you're taking notes, I want you to note that the measles and mumps component of the MMR vaccine has been the same since 1971. And the rubella portion of the vaccine has not changed since 1979. So just make a note of that.
So, I mean, we've been getting the same vaccine. Yes. So today they're giving people the same vaccine that I got in the 80s.
And I got sometime before that. Yes.
Okay. Professor Russell does not want to tell us how old she is at all. No clues. Okay. So measles is something that we hear about a lot, right? Because it's coming back. Exactly. And some of our students are pointing out there are recent cases in North Dallas. I know there are recent cases in Denton because that's where I live. So why does it come back?
It's come back simply because people are not getting vaccinated.
That's it. That's the only reason.
Well, and because we have international travel.
Okay.
So there are parts of countries in the world where measles has not been eradicated. So you combine global travel with pockets in the U.S. where it can sort of take hold. That's exactly why. Now, this chart shows you, so remember I mentioned it was eradicated in the year 2000, meaning there were no cases of measles for multiple years. But then if you look back starting in 2010, we had 63 cases. We reached a peak at 2014 with 667 cases. But this year we already have over, I think, right at 200. And Texas is one of the states.
In 2019?
Yes, already.
200.
Yes.
And it's March.
Yes. So at this rate, we may beat the 667 from 2014.
Wow.
Yes.
But you won't get the measles if you get the right vaccines.
Yes. So all vaccines have a percentage, right. They're not 100% effective. But it is over 90. It is in the 90. Like I think the MMR is around 97 to 99% effective. So with herd immunity, if we all have the vaccine, right, then that 1 to 2% doesn't matter because it just can't take hold and spread.
Right.
But if you have enough people who aren't getting vaccinated, then potentially even those of us who have been vaccinated, some of us might actually get the disease.
So it's important that everyone be vaccinated.
Definitely.
But MMR is the vaccine that was once upon a time erroneously connected to being a cause of autism.
Yes, in our lifetime, this was probably the biggest. So the anti-vax movement isn't brand new, right? Way back when Edward Jenner had the first vaccine against smallpox, people had an issue with knowing that that came from a cow, right? That they were getting something from a cow. So the opposition to vaccines isn't new, but I would say in our lifetime, this MMR and autism, this one, so right here on the screen, you see the publication by Andrew Wakefield, who's a doctor. He was a pediatric gastroenterologist, which means the GI tract, right? He studies stomach, intestines, all that good stuff. This paper that he published in a journal called The Lancet was really what triggered the fear about MMR and autism. Now, I have two quotes directly from the publication that I wanted to share with you. So he even says, we did not prove an association between measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine and the syndrome described. He was talking about an autism spectrum disorder and also, because he's a gastroenterologist, a disorder of the GI tract. So he was making links between the GI tract disorder and some learning delays. He says virological studies are underway to help resolve the issue, but then he goes on to say, if there's a causal link, so they didn't prove one, but if there is one, then we might anticipate a rising incidence of this syndrome after this vaccine. So I think the way it's worded, it makes it seem like more of a fear than what it really is, that they didn't really prove anything in their study. Now, I want to say this about this particular study. It has been retracted. So the Lancet has retracted it. That is very rare in a scientific journal because when you publish something to a scientific journal, it first goes through a review by other experts in your field before it's even published. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think way back when I was in graduate school and I did my work and I had to send it off to be published, not everything you send is going to get published, right? And even if they are going to publish it, they're going to maybe send back comments like, what about this? What about that? And you have to prove that your data is good, that your procedures were good, that your conclusions actually match your data. So it's very rare that something is retracted from a journal, but this one was retracted. And Dr. Wakefield, no longer Dr. Wakefield, lost his license to practice medicine. He was from the UK, so he lost his license to practice medicine.
So we have a question about the MMR vaccine, and that is, can any of those diseases, measles, mumps, or rubella, mutate to the point that the vaccine is no longer effective?
Okay, so that's a great question. So there's lots of different kinds of viruses, and the way that they replicate can make them more likely to avoid vaccines, just like the flu virus, right? It's a great mutator. That's why we have to get a flu vaccine every single year. But I would say, and I'm not a virologist, so I don't study viruses specifically, but I would say as effective as the MMR vaccine has been since 1968, the component of the viruses that they're using in the vaccine is one that is not mutating.
It's not changing.
Right.
Okay. And so if a child gets a vaccine and then after receiving that vaccine is found by doctors to be autistic, how does a person know those two things are connected?
That they are or they're not?
That they're not, because they're not.
So that is an interesting thing. And one of the things that I want to mention about the way we think, we're more likely to believe negative information. So in other words, if I do a study and say, I can't find a link between MMR and autism, the way our brain processes it, well, is there not a link or you just can't find it, right? Versus if I prove this and this are linked. So I think it's like a test of exclusion. We excluded any kind of link, but does that mean there's not a link? Or does that just mean we didn't find it?
Yeah.
But it's almost like, well, you know, I fed my child bananas this morning before he had this vaccine. I mean, which one is the cause if you've never had bananas before, right? It's like throwing dots. Now, here's what I would say. That's the way science works. If you observe something and you think, this happened and then this happened, is this a cause? That's a great question, right? You can have a hypothesis. Is there a link between MMR and autism? The difference is when study after study after study is done to compare. So I have one I'll mention later that I think is the best to look at if you're concerned about this. There's lots of studies out there, but I picked one for you specifically. If you look at the rate of autism in vaccinated children and in unvaccinated children, and there's no difference, that just tells me, how could the link be the vaccine?
Right.
Right.
Same as bananas.
Right.
Okay. Probably.
Yeah. So
what happened to Andrew Wakefield? He published the story.
Yes. He lost his medical license. It was retracted. And I want to explain a little bit about why he lost his medical license and why it was retracted. It was because he failed to declare several financial interests that he had that were directly related to the paper he published. The first is that he had actually been paid £55,000 in a lawsuit where parents were suing back a pharmaceutical company because they said that their children had been harmed by vaccines. So
he had a financial benefit from saying vaccines were possibly dangerous.
Yes. He also, okay, I'm going to skip down a couple of those. He also failed to disclose that he had filed a patent himself for a vaccine that would be a competing vaccine to the MMR vaccine, which would also be financially rewarding to have a patent for a vaccine.
So he wanted to compete with the vaccine that he was saying was dangerous.
Yes. Does it seem ethically sound?
No, not at all. I mean, it seems like trash science.
Yes.
Is that a thing?
That's a thing. I don't know. Trash science is kind of an oxymoron maybe, but the other thing is he mentioned in his study specifically how the children that he did the study on, which there were only 12. So the sample size was small. One thing you learn in science, the bigger the sample size, right, the more valid the data. So very small sample size. A lot of the information that he used was just based on recall from parents from years back, okay? One other kind of questionable thing that you're like, why? He needed control blood samples, right, for children that weren't the study group. He obtained blood for research purposes from normal children who were attending his son's birthday party and gave them 5 pounds for their time. So it doesn't really seem like a valid way to conduct a scientific study to me.
Not at all.
Yeah. So, and the other thing, one of the reasons that he lost his license, so all of those things show his, financial gain there, but also the medical board found that he had subjected these children, these autistic children, to procedures like lumbar punctures,
Oh my God.
colonoscopies, and other tests without approval from the research board for this study. So, whether the children needed those tests or not, I don't know, but to do those for the test, he had not received the proper authority
Approval.
to do that.
Okay.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
So just as one of our students said, just generally a shady person.
And guess where he relocated to from the UK?
I'm going to guess from the look on your face that he lives in Texas.
He lives in Texas.
Yeah.
Yes. So I've been told. Austin. So he's a Texan now. We claimed him, I guess.
I don't claim him.
Okay, this is the one study now. A few slides back, I had a source for you that was a great location for lots and lots of, it was basically a literature review. So use that. There's lots of information for you. I wanted to highlight this one. So in bold there, that's not my words. That's words directly out of this published study. Receipt, meaning whether or not you get the MMR vaccine, was not associated with increased risk of ASD, stands for autism spectrum disorder, regardless of whether older siblings had ASD or not. These findings indicate no harmful association between MMR and ASD, even among children already at higher risk. So this is a study with huge numbers, thousands of children. They looked at children who had been vaccinated and children who had not been vaccinated. They made sure, because there is a higher risk for a child to have ASD if he has an older sibling that has already developed the disorder. So they had those high-risk children in both categories, and they saw no difference between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated.
None at all.
No. And that is found, so there, the journal, American Medical Association there, if you want to read it, make sure, because the other thing I would say, and we'll talk about this a little bit, that I find people will do is they will use an actual peer-reviewed journal, and they will cite that journal, and they will say that it says something that it does not say, or they will pick a tiny detail out of context. Mm-hmm. So I think you should check me.
Check
right?
your sources.
Yes.
Okay. So a couple of our students have asked this, and I think it's a question that a lot of people probably have. So if it's not MMR, what causes autism?
They don't know. And that is the fear, right? That is scary, because we want to know why, so that we can, avoid our children developing that. I have a situation, it's not autism, but my oldest child has a very rare digestive disorder called eosinophilic esophagitis that we did not know he had until he was 7 years old. And suddenly he became very sick. We couldn't figure out what it was. He spent a month in the hospital. He today still has a severely restricted diet. I have a younger son, younger than him. When we found out he had this, we wanted to know, what can we do to keep our other child, like what happened that he developed this? They do not know what causes. They think there's a genetic component to what my son has, but they also think that it has to do with, the food that he eats, part autoimmune, part allergic disease. So I understand the need to want to know, and there's ongoing research about autism, and they're finding, some great information, but the answer is, we don't know.
But they do know that if one child has autism, their younger siblings are at a higher risk.
Which would indicate that there's a genetic linkage there somewhere,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Yes. I want to say one thing that I didn't say earlier when I was talking about herd immunity.
Yeah.
And that is, there are people who cannot get vaccines. Some people can get some vaccines and not others. So we have some people who are immunocompromised. Some people are allergic to some components of vaccines. Some people are undergoing chemotherapy or something, so they have to, their immune system's just not going to be able to allow the vaccine. So one reason we want our vaccination rates to be high is so that these people who actually cannot medically receive the vaccine are going to be covered, because the rest of us all are vaccinated.
So those people and children who are too young for vaccines are relying on the rest of us to be vaccinated to keep the disease from spreading.
Exactly.
And there are rare complications from vaccines, right?
That is exactly right. And just like anything you do, any medical procedure, or even getting in your car, right? We know that there are car crashes, that people get hurt and injured and die from car crashes, but we still drive our car because for the most part, it provides us a service that we really like. It's the same thing for any medical procedure, any medicine you take, right? If you're taking a medicine for, I don't know, a headache, right? There's side effects that you can get from Advil, Aleve, all that stuff. So yes, there are actually adverse events that occur from vaccines. They're very rare.
Rare enough that every doctor, or almost every doctor in the world, would recommend getting all of the vaccines.
Yes.
Because the side effects are not worth risking measles.
That's right.
Okay.
Or polio. And some doctors, I read an article just the other day, are starting to be a little more assertive about, I will not accept patients who do not vaccinate. Because if I'm a doctor and you're my patient and you are vaccinated, but yet you have children who are too young and you're in my waiting room and these other children were not vaccinated and they're coming in with who knows what, you're exposing the rest of my practice. So some doctors are saying, if you don't vaccinate, you can't be my patient.
Interesting. And so schools generally require vaccination unless you have a medical or religious reason for not getting a vaccination.
Yes.
And so most children who attend public schools have been vaccinated.
That varies with the school district. Yes, they're encouraged, but because, different states, and Texas is one of those that has looser regulations, right? Where I have to sign a form that says I have some kind of personal or religious objection to the vaccine, and then I'm good to go to public school. So in some school districts, I think Bayard County in Texas is maybe the highest. I looked that up, but there are some that have much lower vaccination rates than others. Yes.
Okay. I think that's all the questions so far.
Okay. So what you see on the screen right now is from 1994 to 2017. So I don't have data before 1994, but I think we can assume that it was similar.
Yeah.
These are the rates of the vaccination rates for children 19 through 35 months for the MMR vaccine. So what I want you to see is there are a few years, right, where it was a little bit lower. Notice 1998 was kind of low. That's the year that Dr. Wakefield published in the Lancet. Okay, so that may explain some of the issues there. But from 1999 through to 2017, it's a little up and down here and there, but for the most part, right, it's around between 90 and 100%.
Yeah.
And I want us to compare that with the rates of autism. So I think the next slide, hopefully,
is about THIMEROSAL.
Oh, so I'm sorry, maybe we skipped right there. Okay, sorry. Yeah, there's going to be a slide that's going to come up in just a second, and it's the United States. There you go. These are the rates of autism. So if you look from 04 to 18, you see that there's been an increase in the percentage of children who have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Okay, when you compare that increase to the MMR rates, the vaccination rates have been the same. So if MMR really caused autism, and we didn't all of a sudden between 2004 and 2018 have a huge rise in MMR vaccination, then that doesn't seem to.
Right. There's no.
Mathematically, that doesn't seem to work.
So tell me what, I can't say this word. THIMEROSAL?
Yeah, THIMEROSAL, good, yes. So let's talk about THIMEROSAL. We're going to have to do some math on this. Okay, so THIMEROSAL contains, it's a type of mercury, we call it organic mercury because it's bonded to some other atoms, but it's called ethyl mercury, okay? It's important that I make the distinction, there's such a thing as methyl mercury with an M and ethyl mercury with an E. THIMEROSAL contains ethyl mercury. Fish, like tuna and other fish, contain methyl mercury. So methyl mercury is actually more harmful and more dangerous form of mercury than ethyl mercury. Now, I want to make this clear. mercury is toxic, right? We know that mercury is toxic, but lots of things are toxic. And my minor was in toxicology. The first thing you learn about toxicology is it's called the dose response. Everything is toxic at a certain level. So if you look over to the right just for a second where it says, what does toxic mean? I use this story in my class all the time. So in 2007, some of you may remember way back then, the Wii's, Nintendo Wii's were super popular and there weren't enough. So people were like waiting in line all night for their kids' Wii. Well, there was a radio station in California that had a competition for someone to win a Wii, and it was Hold Your Wii, like WEE for a Wii. And a woman went, participated, won the contest, and died because of water intoxication. So my point in that is everything is toxic at a certain level, but we have to understand at what level it's toxic. Like the whole old study about Sweet and Low, you know, with rats. They fed the rats like pounds and pounds of Sweet and Low, and sure enough, they got cancer, right? But that doesn't mean that if I drink Sweet and Low in my coffee that I'm going to get cancer. So anyway, I digress, but.
No, I think that's interesting though. So anything at a certain volume is toxic. So to say mercury is toxic or whatever this word is, thimerosal,
yes,
is toxic. It doesn't necessarily mean at any amount.
Exactly.
Because salt can kill you, water can kill you. Okay.
Exactly. So the half-life, meaning how long is this hanging around in your system? Like how long before your body rids itself of this? So ethyl mercury, which what is in thimerosal, is only 7 days, but methyl mercury, which is what is in fish, is 45 days. So just looking at quantities, there's 25 micrograms. Okay, so if it's been a while since you've done the metric system, right? So there's a gram, and then 1,000th of a gram is a milligram, and 1,000th of a milligram is a microgram. So if you're measuring that out, it would be less than a droplet, right? It's tiny, tiny.
So what you're saying is not a lot.
Not a lot. Yes, scientifically tiny.
Okay.
Methyl mercury is what's found in fish. And I got a website for you there. So again, you can check me out, make sure I'm not lying to you. According to the FDA, they've done lots of studies on mercury in fish because we know that it can be harmful if you consume too much mercury, especially as a young child or a pregnant woman. So let's say that you eat 6 ounces of tuna per week, because that's the limit that the FDA has recommended for us not to consume more than 6 ounces of tuna per week. So 1 part per million, this is a math thing, is the same as 1 milligram per kilogram, okay? And tuna, one of those websites, you'll bring up a chart, and they've done a lot of studies, and they've analyzed different tuna to see how much mercury is actually in tuna. So on average, it's about 0.350 parts per million, or 0.350 milligrams per kilogram. So 6 ounces is equivalent to 0.17 kilograms. So if you have a 6-ounce piece of tuna, that means it's going to have in it 59.5 micrograms of methyl mercury.
More than twice as much as in the flu shot.
Yes. And remember, this is
methyl, not ethyl.
Harder,
yes,
more toxic.
So why is ethyl mercury in the vaccine in the first place?
So that's a good question. So if you've ever gone to get a flu shot, sometimes when you get a flu shot, at least most of the ones that I've gotten recently, they're the single dose. So I usually go to the pharmacy or your doctor. They pull out, it's the preloaded syringe, right? They pull the cap off, they give you the shot. Those single use don't really need a preservative because they're contained in there. There's not in and out a chance for germs. But vaccines and the flu shot still used to be where they would come in this little vial, right? And the vial would have a little puncture top for the needle, and the nurse would go in with the needle, draw out the vaccine, and do that many times. Well, every time you go in and out of that little vial, there's microbes that can get in there. The last thing you want to do is have a contaminated vaccine that you're injecting into someone where they're going to get an infection or a toxin so thimerosal is a preservative to prevent growth of microorganisms. So it's in there for a reason, to protect us, to make sure the vaccines aren't growing something. Now, there was a review in 1999 that showed that there was no evidence of any harm by thimerosal. But you can rest easy and know that most vaccines today don't even have thimerosal in them because we've moved to this single use, right? It's easier. I mean, now you can get a vaccine for almost everything at the pharmacy. So you don't have nurses and you don't have to keep them all all the supplies. It's just a single use. Now, you can still get a flu shot in the multi-dose that has thimerosal. But if that bothers you, if you're worried about thimerosal, you can just go to your doctor's office or pharmacist and ask, do you give the single dose? And if they say yes, then you'll know that it doesn't have thimerosal in it.
And the other thing I want to make sure I get right is this amount of methylmercury that's found in fish is still safe for us to be eating.
Yes, so exactly. So the FDA has done studies and said, as long as you're keeping the limit, they recommend 6 ounces per week of tuna. And you can look on that website, different fish have different amounts. So usually the larger up the food chain, like if you eat shark or something like that, then you might.
So if I were eating 6 ounces of tuna for breakfast, 6 ounces for lunch, and 12 ounces for dinner, I might be in danger of
Having
contracting some toxic levels. But if I eat it once a week or twice a week, then I'm fine.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, good. And it's healthy. So
And you know, that's why they used to call them Mad Hatters. Did you know that?
No.
Because they used a form of mercury in the shaping of the hats.
And so it was turning people who made hats crazy.
Neurological, yes.
Okay.
But my father tells me growing up, he would purchase at the hardware store what he called liquid silver, which is mercury, and played with it. So that was in the 50s, 60s, something like that. He seems to be okay.
So
as far as I can tell.
We get lots of information from lots of places, including this false information that thimerosal is very dangerous. And so what's propagating this? Where are we getting all this bad, false?
So I think it's really interesting. The young man who appeared before Congress a couple weeks ago, who his mother had chosen not to vaccinate him, and when he turned 18, he took the step to get his vaccines because he had himself done research and he was sure that it was safer to have the vaccines than not. And in an interview, he said that his mother had gotten all of her information from one source, Facebook. So I think this screenshot right here is from my Facebook feed a year ago during flu season. It was a friend or family member. This person, Scott Cannon, I have no idea who he was.
But this is forwarded or reposted.
They shared this, right? And we're saying, you know, basically all of you who are getting your flu shot, you're just evil and you're giving flu to the rest of us. So the first thing I noticed was, what? This is the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Like, that's a legit journal. What's going on that I don't know about? Is the flu shot now suddenly I shouldn't get it? So what I realized was when you look up this study, well, first, I just want to read something to you in case you can't read on the screen, if it's too small. It finds that people who receive flu shots emit 630% more flu virus particles into the air compared to non-vaccinated individuals. It shows that flu vaccines shown to be largely ineffective anyway, spread the flu, and that so-called herd immunity is a medical hoax because the herd is actually transformed into carriers and spreaders of influenza. This means that the most responsible way to avoid infecting other people is to avoid, all caps, being vaccinated with the flu shot. Now, this is my favorite part. In other words, people who receive flu shots, myself, are irresponsible spreaders of the flu. They're the ones making other people sick, just as we've observed for years.
And that's not true.
That is not true.
Okay.
This is the interesting thing about this article. When you actually read the article, okay, they went on a college campus in the health center. When people came in and they had active flu, what they were trying to say is, this is really what they were trying to say. How is the flu spread? Do I have to cough on you or sneeze near you? Or if I'm just in the room breathing, am I emitting flu particles because I'm actively infected with the flu for you to get it? They were studying the transmission, like particles in the air. They were collecting that. So every single person that they were studying had active flu. We know I get a flu shot every year. Most years I don't get the flu. Some years I do, right? It's still the flu. I'm still going to emit particles. According to their study, though, males are really the irresponsible spreaders over females because they emitted 320% more than females. So if you want to pick and choose little pieces of information out of their study, that's not what they were studying. Is whether or not people that were vaccinated had more. Now, Is it possible that those that they measured that were vaccinated were earlier or later in their infection? Because it's not like they got a group of people, infected them all at the same time, and measured at the same course. They measured them over several days. So if they measure me and I'm on day 2 and you're on day 1, we have our infections at a different point, right? We're going to be emitting different virus particles. So anyway, just because it's a good source, this is a good source. Make sure that
it's misinterpreting
taken out
the
of context.
information.
Yes.
Okay.
And I know you've seen this on Facebook. All of you've seen something.
Oh yeah, we all see crazy stuff all over the internet.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it's either being misconstrued or the 1 in a million case is being amplified. And that's something we talked about in previous webinars about conspiracy theories, is the rare cases are being amplified so that they're made to seem common or dangerous.
Yes, exactly.
And so there are a few actual vaccine safety issues or things that have happened as a result of vaccines.
Yes.
Right?
That's true. And so I've highlighted some for you throughout history. Now, clearly, when vaccines were first being developed, right, they were quickly producing the vaccine, right? They were trying to, because smallpox was difficult. It was killing people. Most of these were not actually a problem with the vaccine. It was just a problem in the manufacturing. They weren't following the correct procedures, right? So in the United States, we have strict guidelines about, vaccine safety as far as production goes. And the other thing is that our government has, through the CDC, a adverse reaction to vaccines. And I have it later in the slide, but anybody, you, me, a doctor, a nurse, anybody can report an adverse reaction to a vaccine, and then they'll be investigated. And that's a great way so that we know all of these situations where someone has maybe an allergic reaction or, they fainted. All of these are going to be looked into, and that just makes our vaccine program safer.
Yeah, but I mean, sometimes people faint when they're giving blood for a blood test. That doesn't mean blood tests are dangerous.
That's exactly right. And when you look up some of the adverse reactions, it was like head trauma because they fainted, right? Because, not because the vaccine caused it.
They got freaked out.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So, and here's the thing about the flu shot. People have these impressions about flu shots and they spread them like a virus themselves, right? Like, I got the flu shot and then I got sick. I've never gotten a flu shot and I've never gotten the flu. Or I get the flu shot every year and I've never gotten the flu. Like, people have.
Yes.
But what happens to you?
Yes.
That's a single person sample size, which makes it not a valid study.
Right.
And if you got sick after getting the flu shot, number one, it doesn't mean it was the flu. And it doesn't mean it was caused by the flu shot, because it's cold and flu season.
Yes.
So a lot of times, I remember when I taught in high school, they would come to the high school to give us flu vaccines. And sometimes people would get a cold afterwards.
Yeah.
Well, we taught in high school, and it was cold and flu season. So
and
you're probably going to get a cold anyway.
Yeah. And you might have been exposed to the flu, because the flu vaccine is actually not effective for 10 days to 2 weeks. So if you were exposed to the flu on Monday, and then you went and got your shot Tuesday or Wednesday or even Monday, you know what I mean? You still might get the flu. You didn't get it from the shot. You got it because you were exposed to the flu. So the flu shot, here's the thing. You're not going to get the flu from the flu shot. Okay, that can't happen. Some years, yes, you may get the flu shot, and the strain of flu that you're exposed to is different than what was in the shot. And so you might get the flu. That is absolutely true. In my house this year, all 4 of us got the flu shot. I had one child that got the flu and the rest of us didn't. So, the other thing you need to understand is there are multiple strains of flu, flu A, flu B, and then multiple strains within flu A and flu B. And some of those are worse than others, right? So sometimes maybe you did get a strain of the flu, but you didn't get the one that was in the shot because you were protected.
And,
you had the shot.
And I'll just say this. I'm not a scientist, but I know that government employees are encouraged and sometimes required to get flu shots.
Yes.
Members of the military, one of our students mentioned this, are required to get flu shots. So even though it's not, I mean, so vaccines aren't MMR, right? Vaccines aren't flu vaccines aren't 99%
No, they're
effective.
not. No,
But they are helpful, right?
absolutely.
Doctors of senior citizens strongly advise that their patients get flu shots because the flu is more dangerous for them. So the flu shot will not hurt you unless you have a very rare reaction, or if you're me, I'm allergic to eggs, so I can't get flu shots.
Right.
But flu shots won't hurt you, and they could help you.
That's right.
But and other vaccines like MMR, they'll help you.
Yes.
And
I had a pediatrician one time who, so, I mean, I was a young mom at one point years ago, right, with kids, reading some of these things myself. I had a pediatrician who'd been practicing many years who I trusted, who I would ask about each specific vaccine before we would give it. And in his opinion, he'd been practicing a long time, he'd seen a lot. He said, you know, because the flu shot, like you said, is not as effective as other shots. If your child doesn't have asthma, is perfectly healthy, and you choose not to do it, okay, that's your choice. You choose to get the flu or not, you know, who knows. But he said the rest of them, he felt like that was not doing right by your child, because polio, tetanus, all those things are not diseases that you want to have. But yes, so this is the vaccine adverse reporting system that I mentioned to you, that anybody can report an adverse event. Most of those, right, are probably unrelated to the
coincidental.
Yes, but at least it does provide a good database of information. If there starts to become a trend and they see something, then they can look into the safety of a particular vaccine.
So we talked a lot about people who have false impressions about vaccines. Why is it hard for so many people to understand the truth about vaccines?
So I think, as we mentioned before, narrative bias would mean that I go to the playground or something when I have a young child, and there's a mom there next to me, and she tells me how she had this horrible, you know, situation where her child was vaccinated and they got really sick, or they had a seizure or whatever, or they developed. She can say whatever she wants, right? That is a very moving thing to know that somebody went through that, and it makes you feel bad for them. And then you think, oh gosh, I don't want that to happen to me. And it may or may not have anything to do with that vaccine, right? That's just that person's way to correlate those two things. It doesn't mean that it's true, but it's almost like seeing a movie or reading a book. Even though they're fiction, sometimes we get so into that character, right? We get upset when this happens the way that we didn't want it to. It's not necessarily fact.
Stories are powerful. Stories, so events, narratives, things that people tell you, things that people see. So if I have a testimonial, or if it happened to me.
Which is why people use it in marketing, right? To sell something.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, one time I got a flu shot and I fainted.
Yeah.
But I hadn't eaten that day. But I could leave that part of the story out.
Right.
And then Misty, who's afraid of fainting,
would
not get the flu shot.
Exactly.
I don't know. Are you afraid of fainting?
I mean, I don't think anybody's for it, right?
Somebody is. Somebody out there is. Confirmation bias is something I'm a little familiar with.
Yes. So I know y'all talked about that. I just wanted to make sure everybody understood that our natural reaction is to find information and talk to other people who think and just like we do. So if I think vaccines are bad, then I'm going to join groups on Facebook or watch videos on YouTube or read books.
Because those people make me feel smart.
Exactly. We all agree. Nobody wants to feel like the outsider, right?
Yeah. And I think, and one of our students is pointing this out, narrative bias happens, especially in things that have to do with science, because stories are powerful and emotional, and we understand them.
Yes.
Scientific studies, as you've told us, are printed in journals for
jargon. I mean,
scientists.
It would seem like jargon. Yes.
Right? Scientists and doctors.
Yes.
So if I'm not a scientist or doctor, where's the information for me?
So that is a great question. The best place to get that information is from your doctor, because your doctor should be able to put it into words, and you should trust that your doctor's doing the best by you. But the other places you can go to, the CDC does a great job of posting the studies, but then giving sort of a layman's
General public
yes
explanation.
exactly, or the American Medical Association, or any of those legitimate medical communities that they have authority in their field, but their job is to try to educate the public.
And any one of your professors could tell you the difference between the CDC and Bob's Center for Disease and
Yes.
Vaccine Information.
Yes, and one
Net.
thing I always say is, are they selling something on their website? Then that's probably an indication that if they're trying to make money,
Then they're
they're probably not a legitimate scientific source.
okay. Interesting. All right. And obviously, misinformation is a great cause
Yes.
of confusion
Yes.
about vaccines.
Yes. So just like what I shared from my example of my Facebook feed, I think, first of all, there are many, quote, experts out there that are really fake experts, or they may refer to, if you'll notice, there are still people who are referring to Dr. Wakefield's publication in The Lancet, which now has been retracted from the medical community. There's also the expectation, if there's any side effect at all or any negative thing that ever happened with a vaccine ever, then they're all bad. I mean, there's nothing like that. There's no medical procedure that we can get, right, that's 100% effective all the time. And vaccines are the same thing too. But driving my car, I don't have 100% certainty that I'm not going to ever have a wreck, but doesn't mean I don't stop driving my car.
Right. And again, and this is something else we talked about with the flat earth conspiracy theory, right? Resisting the scientific consensus.
Yes.
Because you think if there are so many scientists and they all agree, then they're part of some global vast conspiracy. Right. When the reverse is true. The more people in a conspiracy, the less likely it is to be a conspiracy, right? That many people cannot keep a secret.
No, all the scientists and the doctors and, no.
And I will say this. Earlier you said the best person to ask is your doctor. And a lot of people don't have a doctor.
That's true.
They don't have my doctor, but there are doctors, right?
Yes.
So even if you go to Care Now, you see a doctor. And you can ask that doctor.
Yes.
Hey, I want to make sure that something is safe.
Yes. Or the county, whatever county you live in, their health department.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or even if you go to JPS.
Exactly.
Okay. So a doctor.
A doctor. You can ask my doctor if you want to. Yes. So, too much information. I think sometimes it's overwhelming. It's easier for me to just sit and talk to somebody who is very adamant about how they believe and they give me all the information. It's harder. It takes more time to do the research on your own and take in all of that and make sense of it. And it's hard
to admit that you're wrong. It's hard to admit that you didn't know something.
I hope it doesn't happen to me.
I've never had to do it myself. And you said earlier, people are more likely to believe negative information. So if you say vaccines are 95% effective, a lot of people's very first question is, what about that 5%?
Exactly. Yes. Or if I say, that one study that showed that there was not a linkage between the MMR vaccine and autism, people are more likely to believe things that say that there is. In other words, if somebody says, oh, yes, there is, because if a study says there's not, then your natural reaction is there not? Or were you just not able to find it?
Yeah.
It's just our way we're wired.
I love that you've given us your references.
Okay.
And so if later on you want to pause the video on the screen and you want to look up Professor Russell's references, you can check and read and find this information and make sure that she's not misrepresenting any of the information she gave to us.
And there are some within the presentation too. So yes.
So you can make sure that that Professor Russell was doing it right, which of course we know.
And I didn't spell references right, but I do know how to spell it. So add an extra E in there.
Here on this slide where we're proving credibility, we have spelled a word wrong.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yes.
And then you've given us some topics for further research if somebody is very interested in in the topic of vaccines or in what's happening now.
Exactly.
A lot of students are commenting on current news stories or things that have come up recently, which of course is on our minds because we live in North Texas and there is a measles outbreak. So it is, and Ethan Lindenberger is the kid who, as soon as he turned 18, I think he went to Reddit and said, my parents never got me vaccinated. How do I go about getting myself vaccinated? And doctors on Reddit responded to him and told him, here's just, here's what to do, here's what to say. And he recently testified before a Senate committee.
Yes.
So that's an interesting story if you want to read more about that.
And, there's the case in, I believe it was in Washington or Oregon, the unvaccinated child that got tetanus, and it cost $800,000 in hospital stays. And the parents still will not vaccinate the child. So that's kind of an interesting. And then Texas has a couple of bills before the Senate and the House that has to do with the vaccines. One would allow parents to obtain vaccine information from a school district without an open records request. So right now, if you're thinking about putting your child in school in a school district, you have to submit an open records request to see how many kids have opted out of vaccines. So this would allow you to get that information
openly
without an open records request. The other one would actually stop the Texas Department of Health from maintaining records of vaccine exemption of people who are, don't.
So that's the reverse.
Yeah. So there's two of those. So anyway.
All right.
Yeah.
So,
but I want to say one more thing. I'm sorry. The World
do.
Health Organization, which is bigger than the U.S., right? This is
the World
WHO.
Health Organization.
Yes. They have listed vaccine hesitancy, which is what we're talking about, people's fear to get vaccines, right? So we have a lower vaccination rate as one of the top threats for global health this year because of all of this misinformation that's been spread and people are fearful and our vaccination rates are dropping.
I'm inclined to say we should just shut down Facebook. That might be drastic. Okay. Thank you, Professor Russell, for lending your expertise. And again, I'm sure people are still wondering, will she tell us about being a CSI one day? And the answer is sure. We'll get her to come back and tell us about being. That's all I want to talk. That's all I want to talk to you about.
No Hummer though. Like we didn't get Hummers where I work.
You didn't?
No.
Did you do the sunglass trick?
No.
No. Okay.
Oh, very boring.
So I do want to tell you guys in just a few minutes after the webinar is posted as a YouTube video, the link for credit will appear in the video description. The link will be there for 48 hours. You complete the web form. You put your name, your teacher's name. Please tell us what section you're in so that your teacher can go ahead and give you credit easily. There's a couple questions to make sure that you watched and understood the webinar, and then we'll send that to your instructor. There's nothing else you have to do to get credit. If you're watching this more than 48 hours after the video is posted, you'll need to talk to your professor about whether or not you can get credit and how to do that. We have 2 more webinars this semester in our conspiracy theories series. The next one is on April 6th, also at noon, and it is also about scientific literacy and learning to understand truth from fiction in the world of science. And then the last one we have is about Holocaust denial and those conspiracy theories, and that is on April 30th at 6:30 p.m. So 2 more opportunities to tune in with us this semester, and of course we'll be back in the fall. So if you have questions, check in with your instructor, but the link will be there in just a few moments. And we want to thank you guys for watching and all of your comments and questions. Thanks.